My next guest is well placed to answer this. He's the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Alistair Darling, whose new book, Back from the Brink, is out this week, and he joins me from Westminster. Mr. Darling, thank you very much for joining us. Your book makes fascinating reading. The prologue, in fact, starts in October 2008, and you talk very descriptively about being right there in the teeth of the post-Lehman crisis. Now, in the past few months, there have been a lot of parallels drawn between what's happening now and what's happening then. How do you see it?
I think the risk today is that if you were to have another blow-up in Greece, and if people were to start doubting Greek banks, that would feed back into other banks in Europe. My experience in 2008 is these problems can suddenly blow up, and once they start going wrong, they're very, very difficult to contain, which is why I'm concerned at the apparent inability to get a Greek solution that will stick. I'm also concerned that I think the Eurozone countries are going to have to come back to this problem again. And of course, the fact that it's now clear that the economy is, our economy and other economies are going to bounce along for some considerable period, will put additional strains on banks. So I think there's a lot to be concerned about. That's all the more reason, I think, to try and take action to try and stop this happening.
You talked there about taking action. There has been quite a lot of criticism aimed at Europe's leaders. Do you feel like there isn't the kind of strong leader who, even despite you criticise Gordon Brown, but actually in your book you talk about the strength of Gordon Brown's leadership at that crucial time, sort of almost forcing through his own personality an early response in the G20. Do you feel that there is that kind of character missing at the moment?
Well, yes. I mean, I can tell you the G20 back in 2009 wouldn't have happened, and it wouldn't have had the successful outcome if it hadn't been for Gordon Brown. It was him that drove it, and he deserves immense credit for having done that. The problem today is that neither the leadership nor, in fact, is there the appropriate policies that I think are necessary. If you deal with the Eurozone question, they had a go at it in May 2010, as the last meeting that I attended before we left office. We got a package together then. Unfortunately, it took so long to get the money together, people began to doubt it. They then had to come back and try and fix the Greek problem twice thereafter, and it's quite clear now that they're still having trouble making it stick. I think what's necessary is they need to have an adequate fund available to help countries that get into trouble. I think we need to do far more, and I've said this lots and lots of times, to make sure that banks in Europe can withstand a country defaulting, a sovereign default. And I also think that so far as Europe is concerned generally, including the UK, I think the austerity policies that are being pursued at the moment run the risk of choking off growth, and if you don't get growth, you won't get your deficits down, and that makes it more likely than not that you'll have more problems in the banking system. So I think action is needed. It needs national action, but it also needs international cooperation, and that is in desperate need of some leadership there.
Just before we come back to what's happening today, you do write in your book about the tension that you experienced throughout 2008 and 2009. You talk about brutal and volcanic temper tantrums with the Prime Minister, from the Prime Minister, and a parallel finance ministry being run by Ed Balls. How difficult was it for you to do your job, and what would you have done differently had you been allowed to have your head, as it were?
Well, the phrases you're using aren't, I think, aren't mine. The ones that were appearing last week. There was leaks, some accurate, some not. But yes, of course, the relationship is well documented. Was difficult. My only lesson I draw from this is that in any administration, in any government, you need the administration to work together. There can't be divisions, especially between a Prime Minister and a Chancellor, because they'll show very, very quickly.
But there were divisions, right?
There were, in terms of our analysis as to what was happening in 2008, and then, more recently, what to deal with the deficit. But the reason I set them out is simply because I'm trying to explain what happened during that period. But the lesson I draw from that is a very clear one, that governments need to act very, they have to be really totally united on what they're doing, otherwise you run into difficulties.
No, I want to talk to you about your relationship with Mervyn King. He is supposed to be completely impartial. You describe him as being stubborn and indeed at times exasperating. Do you feel that he would have had more sympathy with a Tory Chancellor?
Well, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, I also, pay a great deal of tribute to Mervyn King and what he did when the bank rescue in 2008. My problem was at the beginning of all this, back in 2007, I thought that we needed to put more money into the system, more liquidity into the system, and the bank was reluctant to do that. And as you know, towards the end of 2007, the system gradually began to freeze up, and that was just a portent of things to come. The broader point I make now is that, as you know, the UK government wants to give the bank responsibility not just for monetary policy, but also for banking supervision, and also responsibility for seeing and ironing out fluctuations in the economic cycle. Now, on any view, it really doesn't matter who the governor is. That's an awful big burden to place on one individual, which is why I think the governance of the Bank of England needs to change. Okay,
I'd like to talk to you about the 50p tax rate, something that you brought in. Now, there's an awful lot of chat about what's going to happen to it now. What are your personal thoughts on it?
Well, I don't think there's any evidence at all, and I've heard none adduced so far, to say that this is holding up growth. I don't think that's what's holding up growth. I think it's a wider economic problems we've been discussing. I think it would be grossly unfair, a huge political mistake, to remove this at a time when many taxpayers who are earning substantially less than some of these people are feeling really squeezed. I've always said it was a temporary measure. I introduced it because I thought it was part of the measures to raise money. It was a fair way that those with the broadest shoulders should shoulder a greater burden, because everybody else was having to do so.
But what if those people don't shoulder the burden? What if they just move to Switzerland?
Well, when I introduced the bonus tax on bankers, I was told by a number of bankers that they would be off to Switzerland. And I say in the book that I spoke to one who said to me, well, have you ever lived in Switzerland? No. These people do threaten governments, Tory governments, Labour governments from time to time. Governments ought to do what is right, and what is right at the moment is that if the present Chancellor genuinely believes we're all in this together, he'd be making a big political mistake to say, but not the ones earning over 150,000.
Have you got any words of advice for Ed Balls? It doesn't seem as if the shadow economic policy is particularly clear in detail at the moment.
Well, look, the shadow economic policy is exactly the same one as I left it with when I left the front bench. And I think it is perhaps unreasonable to expect an opposition to set out everything in the detail you'd expect for the government. After all, the present government, when in opposition, didn't even say they were going to cut as much as they did. So, I don't think it's reasonable to ask an opposition to do that in the same sort of detail. However, the general thrust of the policy is as credible today as it was when I set it out, 3 years ago.
And as for what George Osborne is doing right now, what is the one thing that you would do differently if you were in his shoes today?
I think the real problem is that he's squeezing the life out of the recovery. Now, whether you call it Plan B or a fresh budget announcement in his next budget, I don't care. But I think I think we're reaching the stage now where unless we do something to keep the economy going, we're going to have a long period of pretty barren growth, and that will be very, very bad for us.
Alistair Darling, thank you very much indeed for joining us.